What's going on, Nikki? Welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to this conversation that I feel like we've been having for over a year.
Yeah, we so for those of you that aren't in our direct messages, Nikki and I talk pretty much daily about all sorts of things, but particularly things that we see in the fitness industry, things that are ineffective or, we feel like the industry could do better. And we've done a couple podcasts already together on topics like tiny pink dumbbells. We've talked about Pilates and is it strength training and sort of dug into some of that stuff. So I'm looking forward to this conversation today because we're going to get into it on this episode.
Yes, I think we have a lot of thoughts. So maybe we should just start by framing where we're coming from, do you think, about why we've chosen this topic in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to kick us off there?
Sure. So I think the long short is that we have both had a lot of conversations with people around because we do talk a lot about why strength training is beneficial and valuable in many contexts of life for many populations. And we'll have these conversations with people who are coming from an incredibly well-meaning place, but it usually goes to something the extent of, oh yes, I strength trained, that didn't work for me, or that left me feeling injured, or it made my body feel bad. And then you dig a little deeper and you find out that the version of what they're sort of identifying as strength training is oftentimes a Peloton program or something that is very similar to Peloton, where you are doing strength-like exercises with dumbbells, and depending on your training age, how long you've been training and the type of training you've done in your life and how conditioned you were when you started, you may see some similar benefits to strength training, at least in the short term. But long term, these types of group fitness follow along type classes, they're not bad. We're not hating on them. We're not saying that you shouldn't do them if you love them. If you love them, you should absolutely do them. But they're also not strength training. And when you do that type of programming, particularly if you have issues with recovery, if you are sensitive, or if you have a specific goal around building strength or muscle or bone density, it's not usually the most effective way to go about it. So I know I'll let you jump in, Steph. My take on this is that we are not hating on the workouts, but we want you to be able to make an informed decision. So if those are your goals, you are able to pick an approach that actually is going to work for you and help you get the results you want without feeling frustrated or feeling like your joints always hurt.
Yeah, I appreciate that too, coming from your perspective, your point of view, because you work a lot with folks who have hypermobility. You yourself have hypermobility. And so we constantly are kind of like, I'm constantly sending clients your way and folks who have had that experience. I think from the general population that I'm speaking to, I hear a lot of very similar conversations where it's like, I'm doing strength training, but I'm doing maybe 5, 6 days a week. And it is either I'm having a hard time fitting it all in. I feel like I'm constantly falling behind. And despite, if I can hang on to those 5, 6 days a week, maybe it worked at first, but I've hit this plateau. I mean, plateaus are normal. And I think we have to, we want people to, to adapt and improve, but it's also like plateauing once in a while is fine. Like if we're in a maintenance phase of lifting, that's fine. We're not always going to be, shooting for the moon every single month. But when I hear things like 6 months on, 12 months on, I'm sort of not seeing much progress anymore, or I had progress at the beginning and not anymore. There's one of two reasons why. If I look at the breadth of the answers that the people that I'm talking to, number one is you're making up your own workouts. We could probably do a whole podcast on why you need to outsource, like take that off your plate. Even if you've had a lot of lifting experience, just get a plan, either a templated or one that's written specifically for you if you want to go down that road. But the second reason is oftentimes people will tell us that they are doing these styles of programs. And so it maybe not specifically Peloton, but oftentimes we'll see this where it's some kind of an app that's kind of, got a big production budget behind it. Or it's free YouTube videos that are put out there by certain creators. And when I ask, well, what does the programming look like? How long are the rest periods? Very often we realize that they're falling into this category. And to your point, we want people to move. Like, if your goal is just to stay active, you don't have a lot of goals to, build muscle mass or really increase your strength or work on those sorts of things. And you're like, right now, my priority is just to move my body. Like, that's where I'm at. We're very much supportive of that. The bone I think we were going to pick a little bit more in this episode is the way that things are marketed to the consumer is not necessarily reflective of what they're getting. And then that leads people to, of course, they're like, hey, I can do this strength training program. This is great. And then a couple months down the road, 6 months down the road, they're like, what's going on here? Like, why is this not working for me? So I think that's kind of where I'm coming from too, just to kind of set the stage for the audience from who I tend to work with. But yeah, I think we're going to get into this, and there's a lot of context and nuance and caveating that's going to happen in this episode. So just listen through. We're not here to rain on anyone's favorite workouts or diss their, are we saying diss these days? Can I bring diss back? Like, we're not here to diss on your workouts. But if you do have specific goals, we want you to find something that's going to be effective for you.
Yeah, exactly. So shall we get into
we have notes, by the way. You have notes. You brought
I
notes.
do have notes.
Yeah.
Otherwise I will tangent. So maybe we should start with sort of delineating what is a circuit training type workout from like what is a strength training program, because I feel like this is one of the most confused topics for people, because they go, well, circuit training is strength training because I did multiple sets of exercises with dumbbells with rest periods. And this is, I think, where the nuance is really, really important, because the finer details of that description are the difference between what is essentially going to be muscular endurance training and what is actually going to be strength training for the sake of the things that you and I like to talk about, like strength, bone density, hypertrophy, maybe power, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I think the tough part for a lot of people is that, and we're just going to use Peloton in this podcast as just a brand name to refer to, but there are other brand names. It could be a brand name workout, it doesn't have to be. And you and I have both, just in case anybody thinks we're talking out of our ass here, we actually both signed up for a month of Peloton workouts to really go through the programs with a very fine tooth comb. So again, we're not just kind of talking out of our asses here. Like we did go through and reviewed some stuff, but when we think of circuit training or we're looking at apps like this, we see a lot of things that overlap with, like you said, strength training for the purpose of improving our force production, our power, or working hypertrophy, which is muscle building. So for example, in circuit training, you might very well pick up dumbbells, and these dumbbells could be fairly heavy, or maybe you're doing even a group fitness or a class style where you go and it's mostly circuit training and you have a lot of different exercises. Sometimes they're grouped together in, I don't know, giant sets. Sometimes there are trisets or things like that. So again, that's a technique that sometimes will superset or even triset in strength training. But where things tend to fall down is kind of where you've alluded to rest periods, loading, and things of that nature, volume even. And so this is kind of where people get a little bit lost in the sauce, because as you'd expect, you see, oh, I'm going to open my app and like, yeah, I want to do some strength training. So you're going to open that workout, and all of a sudden they're like, yeah, get your medium dumbbells, and you're like, okay, great. This is awesome. And so what's going to happen is you're doing, usually it's a time based. So 45 seconds on, 15 seconds off, or something like that, where you only have a very short period of time to rest before you're back at another set of that thing. And just by the nature of how we can load things. And I don't think sometimes we do a good job explaining this, or we assume people understand this. The heavier something is, the fewer reps of that thing that you can do. Period. Like your muscles just will not be able to keep contracting rep upon rep upon rep upon rep. You're going to hit a stopping point at some point. And so if the weights are more light to medium, which typically you're going to see even in a program that's sort of using this circuit style of training, you're doing sometimes, 12, 15 plus reps. The rest is very short. And that is going to build, or that's going to challenge the ability for your muscles to keep contracting for those longer amounts of repetitions versus something like a heavy, I don't know, a heavy set of 3 to 5 deadlifts. If I try to do another 3 reps, I'm going to die. Like there's just, I'm not going to get the weight off the ground. And because it's so heavy, if it's truly a heavier type of, again, we're working strength, we're working force production, I have to allow my muscles to rest, to regenerate ATP, to clear any metabolites that could be accumulating. Because even if we're doing a short set, we're still going to get a little bit of that. And to be ready for the next set. If I try to do a heavy set of 3 deadlifts in 15 seconds from when I just stopped, I will die. I will not get the weight off the ground. It's not going to happen if it's truly heavy. So I think that just as a little bit of to kind of like put a bookmark in this one, or to just kind of tie a little bow on this, the more reps you're doing with short periods of rest, you cannot lift heavy enough to recruit as much muscle fiber as you would need to challenge your muscles to eventually work on that max force development, that truly heavy type of strength training. Not that we're going to do that for every single set of everything we do in a well-rounded strength program, but sometimes it is just missing because you're constantly moving. It's 15 seconds of rest and then you're back at it again. And then you've got 15 different exercises that you're doing in that, or 20 different exercises that you're doing. And I've seen them on YouTube where they're like, no repeats. So you're doing literally 15 to 20 different exercises. And when you add up the volume, that's the number of reps times sets that you're doing. We're doing hundreds, 300, 400 repetitions. And that volume, I know for your community, especially, I mean, for any human, is going to be hard if we're loading it well, but for your community can be really challenging. So can you speak to sort of from your perspective, your community, why the volume piece with these types of muscular endurance or circuit type training is oftentimes really difficult?
Yes, please. And it's kind of like you read my mind because this is where it gets tricky. So a lot of the people I work with have chronic conditions. They're hypermobile. They have a history of pain or injury. They're prone to pain and injury. And there's a lot of really valid concern around those things. I want to be clear, those concerns are very valid. But a lot of what is sold to us is that doing a heavier weight is quote unquote dangerous, and we should go for lightweight and high reps, which makes us sometimes feel like we see these circuit type workouts and go, oh, that's designed for me. And then we wonder when we do it, why afterwards we feel awful. Our symptoms are worse, our joints ache, our muscles hurt, and we can't move for days, or it really does set off a cascade of like very negative effects. And part of that goes back to preparedness to load, sheer amount of volume, and how hypermobile bodies or sensitive bodies, even if you're not hypermobile, respond to stimuli. So we know, particularly with hypermobile humans, but really anyone who's kind of got a sensitive system, that it, while the load or the weight that you pick can influence your level of soreness, the newness or novelty or number of exercises you do, combined with the sheer volume or number of repetitions and sets that you do, is far more likely to make you sore, even with a very light weight, than if you picked a small number of exercises that you did really well with a moderate to heavy weight, which would actually create favorable adaptations to your muscles and your tissues in a way that would actually promote or mitigate against promote healing, mitigate against injury, all of that kind of stuff instead. So I think that's one of the things that's really interesting here is that sometimes we're sold that doing higher repetition of lots of different things with lightweight is safer. I'm doing safer in air quotes, when really, if we actually did a certain amount of repetition of a couple exercises that we gradually increase the load of over time, hint, hint, that's what a strength training program does, we'd be better off. And the other thing I want to just add in there is a lot of the conversations I have in my community is they go, well, I can't lift heavy. That's right. I know I'm going to hurt myself, or I don't feel safe doing that. So because I know when I go to do these classes or I try these things, I try to just lift the heaviest weight I can that day and it feels terrible. That's part of what is missing from sort of these Peloton style programs and these circuit workouts, is that if your strength training program is set up in a way to make sense, it should slowly and gradually kind of teach you how to master a technique and increase the weight over time with appropriate amounts of time where we deload and we offset stress and we back things off before we start to ramp things back up again. And that is actually what prepares your tissues and your nervous system and your body to lift heavy without feeling awful all the time. But that's not existing when we're just doing these circuit workouts that often have a series of random exercises that are just hammering the same muscle group over and over and over again with kind of random weights. It's just not the smartest way to train. So if you have a sensitive body, that programming, I think, arguably actually matters more in those situations. I don't know what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, I completely agree. And how I see that play out. And of course, I would wager, there's going to be a certain degree of clientele that in my community that have hypermobility who are doing regular types of strength training programs. Maybe they're not doing something that is from a person like you, which, by the way, go work with Nikki because you're really smart and you're great at understanding where people are coming from. How I tend to see it is, even if somebody is lifted, let's say in the past, they took a break and they're coming back. And I totally get this. Like, they're like, okay, I already have this app, or I'm going to get this less expensive entry point. I'm going to, the $7, the $10, $15 a month type of thing. It's got a million different programs to choose from. And almost without fail, you start off with such high rep work. It's the exact opposite of what you and I tend to do. And you even more so. I know that you take the volume even further down than I would typically for somebody starting out. But what happens is, because maybe you haven't trained in a while, so you've got just novelty for the sake of you haven't done these exercises in a while. And you have the volume, which is, again, as we said, reps times sets. And your thought process at first is like, it's lighter, therefore it will be safer for me to get started. Maybe it's even body weight. But I see devastating effects from high volume body weight squats, even, push-ups, those sorts of things. And so when somebody is starting out, they're coming back into lifting, they need to ease back in. Oftentimes, if we're going online, we're finding something on YouTube, same thing. It's like reps on reps on reps. It's so many reps. And that is going to make you super sore. You're going to be so sore. And again, sometimes we think, oh, the soreness means it's working. I did a good job. And so we continue to seek that out. Or in some cases, it's made us so sore that doing daily life is miserable. If you've ever given yourself real DOMs, everything hurts. It's like REM. It's like everything hurts and you want to die. Everybody hurts. I don't know if listeners will know that reference, but it's like you go to sit down on the toilet and you're like, toilet trust fall, hope it's down there because I just can't lower myself down. One time I gave myself DOMs so bad and I was getting on an airplane the next day. And guess what I couldn't do with my little T-Rex arms? I couldn't lift the bag up overhead because my arms were so trashed. And so, sometimes we think, well, that just means it's good. It means it's working. So we're going to go back and do it again and again and again. Some people, it will be enough to turn them off to lifting. Totally. They're like, I'm not doing that shit again. Like, I ended up so sore. I don't want to do that. That's terrible. But sometimes it ends up being that we chase that sensation thinking that means we did it right. Or, it's making us completely sweaty and out of breath and rolling around on the ground. And there is a time and a place for things like interval training and cardio, of course. But for people that are more adapted and not brand new to this style of circuit training, it often ends up being a little bit more like a cardio workout and a little bit less like a true strength workout, again, to kind of hit those different aspects. And so we kind of get this situation sometimes where people are either terribly DOMs to hell, or they're kind of overtrained, but yet they still aren't getting good adaptations because they're not able to move the weight or, do whatever variation of an exercise they need to progress. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
I mean, yeah, in summary, right? We're seeing a certain level of underloading with overtraining, which essentially just means you're working really hard to be tired and sore, but you're not going to see any of the favorable adaptations or results that you're working really hard for. And that's lame. Like, no one wants that. And I also want to just say, like, I get why we end up like taking these classes or starting out in group fitness. Like, I got my start in group fitness, and it can be very entertaining. And I appreciate not wanting to be quote unquote bored. But the problem is with the way that these classes are structured, whether they are in person or, again, we're kind of going Peloton style, is you don't have any time to really assess what your weight selection is. So, like, you and I both watched these classes. I watched one of them, and it was like they started with the fitness assessment. All right, drop down. Let's do some push-ups, as many push-ups as you can in 45 seconds. Like, that's not assessing your strength. That's assessing your endurance and how willing your wrists are to tolerate doing a dozen push-ups in 45 seconds, which if you haven't done push-ups in ever or in 5 years or something, your wrists are going to feel really shitty. And that kind of, not to tangent us, brings me to kind of another issue though with these classes, which is there are no exercise options. There really aren't any modifications. I mean, I guess you can put your knees down in the push-ups, but if you have someone who has wrist stuff, that's not going to allow you to load in a favorable way that doesn't make your joints not hurt, for example. And so I think that we do end up in kind of this frenetic place where right off from the get-go, our assessment for what is effective is already flawed because we're not even actually, again, these are build as strength programs, but we're not actually assessing strength. We're assessing muscular endurance. We have a very limited number of weights that are being used very arbitrarily. Like, if your squat weight and your deadlift weight are the same, there's probably a mismatch in the weight selection. So we're having no discussion about RPE. How hard should it feel for the given rep schemes? We have no rep schemes. Do as many as you can in 45 seconds. Maybe that's 6 reps, maybe that's 12 reps. So also, we don't know if we're working strength, hypertrophy, or muscular endurance. What is the goal? So when you have all of those things missing, like, it's just kind of like it's chaos. So it's really hard to track what you're doing, what weight you used, if you're progressing, if you have pain after the workout, what exercise, if any, was the cause of the pain. Like, it's just so hard to track any measure of progress. And I think that's a problem if you are someone who is data driven, or, again, you want some sort of specific outcome related to strength training as a result of your efforts.
Yeah, 100%. I saw the assessment as well, and I sort of was like, that's interesting. So would totally mirror what you said there. And, when I also kind of see combo moves, there's nothing wrong with a combo move. I mean, gosh, if you really love the idea of like a bicep curl to a back lunge, like, I don't know, just do your thing. But at the end of the day, and you kind of hit on this with the distinction between the squat and the deadlift. Look, most people who've been in strength training long enough, and this is again why it's confusing for beginners quite often, and people who are just coming into what they think is strength training by using apps and free YouTube programs that say they're strength training, but they're more circuit training, or they end up being intervals or something like that, is it may not be inherently obvious to someone who's newer that you should not be able to squat as much as you can deadlift. You should be able to deadlift more than you can squat. why the deadlift is kind of technically a pull, right? We know that our human bodies are stronger at pulling than they are at pushing. Um, in the back squat, if we're going to do a goblet squat, even we're kind of almost like wearing the weight on our body versus like the weight is really hanging down lower to the ground. So we should be able to deadlift more than we can squat. We should be able to use exercises on all of the exercises of our lower body should generally be stronger than our upper body. And then also to your point, if we're doing a push up and we're trying to do that from like I don't know what you would call it, I would call it just a regular plank position push up, we are carrying a significant amount of our upper body mass for that exercise versus, let's say I'm going to do some kind of like a banded chest press, or I'm going to do a floor press and kind of, lay down on the ground and I'm pressing up almost like a bench press. Then I can fractionally decrease that weight. But when I'm doing something like a combo move, that's usually it's going to be a lower body and an upper body exercise together. I don't know, like I said, curl to reverse lunge. My lower body, either I pick the weight that's going to challenge me in the lunges, and that means I can't curl, I can't bicep curl the weight, right? Or I pick a weight that is appropriate for the bicep curl, and then I'm constantly underloading my legs.
Yep.
So, it's I don't know if you have any other thoughts about some of the exercise selections that you saw, or like some of the pairings that you saw, or things that maybe did or didn't make sense, so that people can kind of like, I mean, I hope that people listen to this episode and they're not just like, oh, Steph and Nikki go dunk on all of these circuit training apps, but also to give the people listening a few things that they can kind of go out and go like, oh, actually, I don't know, like, does that make a lot of sense? Or should I change the weights? Or, like, how do you think, like with exercise selection and stuff, you saw some things that were a little bit like, I don't know, or anything else?
Yeah, I mean, we had some fun back and forth on these.
We
But
did.
what I will say is, and maybe we should have a discussion about some of the challenges for many people about doing upper lower body splits. But
Yeah.
so the program I looked at, which looked like one of the more sensible ones, I'll say, was 3 days a week, and it had like an upper body push, an upper body pull, and then a lower body and core. And even that to me is kind of interesting. You would only do lower body 1 day a week in that way, but we can unpack that in a moment or later or never. But generally speaking, with the way that programming often goes, doesn't have to always be that way. We tend to start with sort of the main global exercise first. So that might be something like your squat on 1 day, your deadlift, and overhead press. I like to pair those two together, as I think you do as well. There might be a day that like the main heavy lift for, right, might be chest press, that sort of thing. That might be kind of a main event, a main lift, and then there will be accessory work that supports it. So we kind of go big to small a lot of the time for many reasons, which maybe you want to get into in a moment. So if I look at, I have it in front of me, I wrote down the order because I knew I wasn't going to remember it in 5 minutes, right? The first set of exercises we do for 2 rounds is and all with the same weight. 45 seconds of overhead press, 15-second rest, 45 seconds of a front raise, and then 15 seconds rest, and then a tricep kickback. In the video, he didn't tell you to switch the weights. He did the same weight with all of those. I don't know about you, Steph, but right off the bat, the overhead press, I guess, can be one of the main exercises, but then later we're doing the chest press. So like from a programming standpoint, most of us who have shoulder stuff are going to feel better if we say, I wouldn't necessarily pair those two together all the time, but we would usually feel better if we did the chest press, more of the horizontal actions first, and we did more of the vertical actions, right? The overhead press second. So that's a little wacky. That's kind of out of order. But even just in this first circuit, my overhead press weight is very different than my front raise weight, which is probably different than my tricep kickback weight. So we already have a mismatch in just the first 5-10 minutes with exercise selection and weight selection. And then if we keep going through this workout, we end up doing the same weight for a chest press as we do for a chest fly with tabletop legs, which I thought was an interesting choice because it's going to be really hard to leverage a chest fly exercise with your feet off the ground. So I'm not entirely sure what the focus there is. And then we do push-ups. that is also going to be a brutal circuit for even someone who is not like me and they're not hypermobile and they don't have issues with recovery. Like, I'm not sure why we're hammering the chest 3 times in a row with almost no rest after we've already done a bunch of accessory work in one main lift. I don't know if that makes sense, but like, we're now halfway through the workout and it's just kind of a grab bag. And that's not great from a programming or recovery standpoint, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head there with the same weights being recommended. And I know they're sort of like, oh, if you need other weights beyond that, but they give you almost no time to change weights out. And you can pause workouts, right? You can pause the video, like in the app, you could pause YouTube and kind of stop and change things out. But it's sort of disruptive to the flow, the whole flow of how the workouts are supposed to work, right? It's like just kind of keep moving, keep moving, keep moving. So I feel like a lot of people would feel pressure to just pick a weight and stick with it. So like you said, for the shoulder press, they're either going to be picking a weight, for example, that they could do the front raise, which is going to be a very much an isolation exercise, kind of like the tricep kickback, but they're going to pick a weight that they can do for that. And then that means that for the shoulder presses or the overhead press, whatever we're calling it, the dumbbell press, that's probably going to be underloaded, or vice versa. We pick a weight that's appropriate for that. And then we end up not being able to actually do the front raise as well, or we have to really use a lot of momentum because it's heavy and we're like, oh my God, I'm getting so fatigued. And I think even if you did pick a weight, let's say you picked 2 different or 3 different dumbbells that you could do appropriately for each one, your shoulders are going to be fucking smoked. Like, I
Yes.
don't know how you're going to raise your arms over your head after this workout. Like, I truly don't. Your upper body is going to be trashed to pieces. And if you are appropriately loading it, right? Like, you're going to be so tired, so exhausted. I would say for my community, what I tend to see is, because my population tends to not have as many issues with hypermobility, but oftentimes I'm getting people that are doing other sports or other rec hobbies or things like that. So you're going to go and really just, you're going to push till the cows come home. You're doing all of your upper body pushing. And the next day you're going to try to go to play pickleball or do jujitsu or go swimming because you're a triathlete or something. And your upper body is going to be super tired. You're going to be really fatigued or really sore. And so one of the reasons I typically don't favor something like upper lower splits is twofold. Number one, if you are that kind of multi-sport athlete or you're kind of doing multiple things, quite oftentimes it gets a little tricky with programming your strength training and your other sport or hobby activity around that. So like, let's say you're a runner and you're going to do upper lower split, but you're going to also run 4 or 5 days a week. You're going to have those lower body days. If you do that lower body workout and your legs are absolutely smoked, it's going to feel hard to go on your run or vice versa. Right. So I'm not saying you can't do it, but it gets trickier the more things you're doing. And we love like a multi-passionate moment for being involved in all sorts of different activities. It just, for a lot of people, becomes challenging. And when you add in the factor of being over 40, which is my audience, if you let's say you were supposed to wake up in the morning and do your lower body on this upper pressing, then upper pulling, and then lower body split, that's the 3 days a week. Let's say the night before you slept like shit because you were having hot flushes all throughout the night, or you're tossing and turning and you didn't sleep. And you wake up in the morning and you're like, you know what? Not today, Satan. This is not happening. Now you've completely missed your one lower body exercise, or sorry, your one lower body session for the week, especially if you can't get back to it. So I just tend to not see, for a lot of people that are involved in other sports or activities or trying to deal with fatigue. And I also do see, even though my community is not super high on the hypermobility side, just a lot more joint pain and discomfort, right? As estrogen declines, right? Estrogen, we know, plays a really important role in like our tissues staying supple and like not getting stiff and things like that. So we kind of take estrogen out of the picture in a lot of cases because that's what happens. And we have a lot more like soreness, stiffness, joint pain, those sorts of things, constantly hammering just that one part of your body. I just see for a lot of people doesn't lead to great outcomes because of all the things I just listed. But I'm not saying you can't do upper lower splits, but I think for a lot of people, they just do that because they think that's what's right. Or they, again, will open up a program like this one that we're talking about or on YouTube or something. And they're like, oh, okay, today's a lower day and I'm going to try to run tomorrow. So I guess fingers crossed or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could make an argument for there might be a time and a place where an upper lower split would make sense for someone. It's what they enjoy, or like sometimes like I work with people where they have positional issues. So they have something like POTS where if they change position too many times, it makes their symptoms worse. And so like there might be a time and a place where you pair exercises in a certain way as a workaround to minimize symptoms. So I can think of arguments for it, but I think even if we're going to look at, let's say, the upper lower split, something that doesn't necessarily make sense to me here in a choice like this particular Peloton program I looked at was they put all of the upper body pushing in one workout. So they trashed you in one direction.
Mhm.
And even if you're going to upper lower split it, you can upper lower split it where you don't just hammer the same muscle group for 30 minutes straight for double the amount of repetitions of what I put into a standard 1 hour program for someone for context. And that's the less conservative version of the program I offer people. And I don't offer it because I think everyone is like a delicate flower. It's because we know that if you don't feel awful all the time and you're able to do high quality work with appropriate weight and appropriate rest, you will be able to see the results you want and not be super ridiculously sore. And to your point, Steph, like even if someone is not they're not doing a whole bunch of activities, there's someone who maybe, right, they're super busy, they are a parent, they have a very stressful job, they have other things to do. Most of us can't afford to be just taken out of commission because we trash the hell out of our pecs for 30 straight minutes. Like it doesn't make sense for your workouts to basically take away your ability to function and care for your children or do your job or live and enjoy your life. And I think that's what we're trying to get at here is there is a way to program things where you get the same amount of work done or less work done, but you get much better results because how we put things together makes a huge difference in the short term, but particularly in the long term.
Yeah, 100%. One thing I know we also talked about um is I was just like going mentally back to all of our conversations. But one thing that we talked about is the idea of what happens after the 4 weeks or the 6 weeks or the 8 weeks in some cases. And most of the programs, again, that we looked at, even the ones that I've seen online, they tend to be 4 weeks max, sometimes six, occasionally eight. I mean, that's a stretch in most cases. And so I think one of the things we oftentimes run into with, folks who come from this kind of programming and they come to work with us and they're like, "Oh shit, like, oh, so I have to do I'm going to be back I'm going to be squatting again in the next 4 weeks," or, like these programs tend to encourage people to recycle this they'll either recycle the same exact thing over and over again, or it's difficult to track what the progression would be to the next thing. So I'm wondering if you can speak from your point of view on things like how and why these kinds of programs maybe not the best for progression. And we've kind of alluded to that a couple times, but it either does that or it fosters the idea that we have like the way to do it is to constantly change things up and confuse our bodies. So can you speak to those issues that you've seen?
Yeah, absolutely. And then maybe you can piggyback on how they also affect your community. So I'll say a lot of the people I work with are, again, new to lifting, prone to soreness, prone to injury. And one of the things that is almost counterintuitive is that repetition is not to make you bored. It's actually incredibly valuable because when you do repetition, it allows you to thoughtfully increase weight over time. And again, we can make little changes to tempo. So like how fast or slow we do an exercise or the leg position, that kind of thing. But generally speaking, that is how your body is able to adapt. So that is how you prepare your muscles and your tissues and your nervous system to be able to go from lifting fairly light weights to be able to transition to lifting heavier weights over time. So that is one way that we are able to see progress. And as our body adapts, then that is also what is going to allow us to not be as sore, because again, if you're someone who chases soreness, this might not make sense to you, but most of us don't want to feel sore all the time. And I work with a bunch of people who already have had a ton of pain and soreness. They don't want to feel worse. Like the goal here is to feel better, in my opinion. So I think that that's a really important piece of it, is that there is sort of a time and a place for doing things a certain number of times or repeating workouts. And then because we also need stimulus to change, and you don't want to be just like bored out of your skull, some level of novelty can be very valuable. So there are times to mix things up. But the issue here is that if you are just repeating something forever and ever and ever, then you end up being in very narrow movement patterns. So you don't have a lot of diverse movement or novelty, which means that you're not typically as resilient or able to move in lots of different directions and handle the challenges of life. And if you're just constantly chasing novelty, you are going to be probably sore as shit, and you're not going to see a lot of progress or progression because you have to do things more than once or twice or even 3 times for your body to adapt, for you to be able to see long-term changes. So it's just one of those things. There is a place and time for repetition. There's a place and time for introducing a little bit of novelty and play and movement. But if we're not accounting for those variables in a thoughtful manner, once again, we get chaos, and then we kind of wonder why everything feels pretty shitty, or why like we're chronically injured, or why we're really tired all the time, but we actually feel like maybe like our body composition's gotten worse, or we're just not seeing any improvement, or now something that once felt fine to do now really hurts your knee or your hip or your back or all of the above. And you kind of wonder what happened. And it usually is some combination of either it's a repetitive stress injury, you've done way too much of one thing, or it's too much novelty, way too much, too fast, too soon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think yeah, I would echo everything you said. The thing that I see quite a bit is having to do with this sort of like entertainment factor and the idea of randomly working out versus training. And again, I just want to say, and I'm going to probably say it 15 more times, because if you're at this stage in your life where you're like, I'm just randomly, like, I'm just doing whatever workouts I can to stay active, and that's my main priority. Absolutely. Does that have benefit? Yes. Is that okay for where you're at? Of course. But if you are knowingly going into it thinking, okay, like now I really need to get serious about increasing my strength, I'm in my 40s or 50s or 60s or whatever it is, I need to really, you know, this is a priority for me. I want to get stronger. I want to build some muscle mass, stay out of sarcopenia. I want to positively impact my bone density. Then we know that there are ways that we need to train to get those benefits, right? To get those adaptations. So I think sometimes we get a little bit confused again, because we're like, okay, well, I'm doing something, I am working out, but the workouts aren't necessarily built for that purpose. And I think that's, again, what we kind of keep coming back to is a lot of the times what you see advertised as strength training or hypertrophy training isn't actually either, because the loads are way, way, way too light, and they're not challenging you enough. There is there's some dogs going crazy in my neighborhood. There is something to be said for the idea that with hypertrophy, we can get hypertrophy across more of a range of rep ranges and things like that. But what I do see a lot is people um want they want their workouts to be super duper entertaining, and by that it usually means it's changing up all the time. There's this novelty aspect. It like no 2 days are alike. And there are certainly different kinds of exercise companies and things like that, that's their main thing. It's like, you never know what we're going to throw at you.
Muscle confusion, Steph.
Muscle confusion. So it ends up being that sometimes people will get on a sensible strength training program that does include an appropriate amount of repetition. And they think this is so boring because they're used to things being constantly different. Now I'm pretty known for saying, get like use cardio or your sports or whatever else you're doing to get your spice. I mean, if you're like, I just need to like change it up and do something fun, like I can think of, you want 20 different ways that we can give you some interval training. Yes. We're just trying to hit those cardio, ranges for you and get some cardio adaptation, of course. But when it comes to training, like if you want to increase your deadlift, you have to deadlift in some way, shape, or form. And it's going to, we could argue all day about sumo versus trap bar versus conventional. And that's not really the point, but like you have got to, if a lot of people in my community are like, oh, I want to get to 300 club in my deadlift. And I'm like, well, how often do you deadlift and how often do you deadlift relatively heavy? And they're like, I don't know, like every once in a while. And I'm like, that's not going to do it. I mean, if you have that goal, you want to increase your deadlift by, to a certain level or by a certain amount of weight or a certain percentage or whatever it is, you have to do that thing fairly often. And there is beauty in that repetition. There is practice and getting to know the weights and getting to refine your technique. Because if somebody comes in and they've been squatting for say 3 months, their squat, unless they're incredibly gifted, is going to look very different at 3 months than it will at a year or at 2 years. Like you mature into these movement patterns, but only when you have the chance to practice them. And I think we're very accepting of the idea of practice in a lot of different areas of life. We're like, practice makes perfect. Oh, hey, I'm like gonna, practice my Duolingo. I'm like learning Portuguese or whatever it is. We're very into the idea of practice, but for some reason, when it comes to strength training, if it's not set to like a different popular playlist every single time, and like it's always something new, novel stimulus, we're kind of like, oh, this is super boring. And I'll also echo Liz when she was on the podcast, and she kind of made mention of the idea that if you think your strength training is really boring, sometimes it's because you're underloading. Because when you're loading things appropriately heavy, there's not a lot of time for your mind to be anywhere else and for you to go, gosh, this is so boring.
Yes.
So
And I think, I mean, I also think though that, right, like people think sometimes that with a strength training program that they're like, well, I can't be consistent. Or again, I have these pain flare-ups and these chronic conditions and my life is like all over the place, even if I don't have some sort of thing going on with my body. And so that's oftentimes the deterrent from following a program. But if you're working with a coach, or even if you're in a group program setting and you have some level of access and support to that person, there is a way to adjust programming so you have a base, even if it means that some days you have to shorten that program. Some days you have to just do something else or cherry pick a couple of the exercises because your body is like, nope, we're not doing half of this. You're like, okay, we'll do what we can. And because it's full body, it's fine, right? So I think that if with the right amount of education or support, there is also a way to adjust a program for kind of life being kind of lifey. And if you are someone who knows that you need a certain amount of novelty, you very well could work with a coach who gives you the stuff that you need that's kind of the base, and then gives you sort of like your quote unquote playtime to sort of mess around. This also part of the program. So you sort of have this piece of it that feels consistent where you don't have to think so hard and then your body has a chance to adapt. And then you have this time to sort of fuck around with the things you want to fuck around with. Like, I think there's a time and a place for everything. And I think programming can be done in a very broad way and can be made very specific to the individual and their needs and their interests. But at the same time, there has to be some sort of logic and base. And this is probably not a great selling point, but learning new things and instilling these habits is hard sometimes. It is a learning curve. It does require some amount of education. And it's absolutely fine if someone doesn't want to do any of that and they choose not to do any of that. I'm huge on body autonomy, but there is a lot of benefit sometimes to doing the hard, tedious thing. And it isn't hard and tedious forever. Once you understand it better, you're usually able to find ways to like enjoy it or make it interesting or get interested in the process of learning it, or be like, yeah, I don't always want to like do yet another fucking squat, but like it's kind of cool. I can do a whole lot more than I used to, and now my knees don't hurt all the time. So a lot of it too is how you're framing it. If you look at something and you're like, this is terrible and I'm so bored and I'm going to hate it, correct, you will absolutely hate it. I promise you 100%. If you expect something to be awful, it will be. And I don't mean that, I don't say that to be an ass. I'm just saying like our perspective does affect our experience sometimes.
Yeah, totally. I think there is value in learning to, I mean, I heard a friend of mine saying this to his son not that long ago, which is like, this is the time where he gets to just be bored. Insofar as, we have so much stimulation at our fingertips now that we've almost kind of lost and I'm the first one to say, I'm like, oh, like what's going on? Oh, I'll check my phone. But there is this idea of kind of chopping wood, carrying water, and there can be value in that repetition, in that quote unquote boredom, if you choose to find it. And that's kind of what I hear you saying. And like you said, yes, I mean, in my program, we're squatting every week, but you also have the freedom to choose from a few different types of squats depending on what works for your body. And I do, for example, put front squats in there. And then sometimes it's very new to people and they're like, oh, actually, this really hurts my wrist. And I'm like, you know what? Cool. Like, here are these other ways that you can hold your hands on the bar. And sometimes that's enough to give people the flexibility to find which variation of the front squat works best for them. And sometimes after trying for a few weeks, they're like, you know what? Nope, just still don't like it. I'm like, cool, back squat. Like, it's not the end of the world. Or goblet squat or whatever variation of that's going to work for you. So I think that, just knowing you and knowing what you do and kind of thinking about how my program probably has some parallels, like we want to give people the structure and give you enough wiggle room and flexibility to say, you know what, how else I could do that? I could do this. And like, it's still in the same universe of movement patterns. And it's going to keep you moving forward toward those goals that you have of strength, of hypertrophy, or whatever it happens to be. That it's not just so random that you're not going to reach your goals. You are going to move closer to your goals because there are some constraints. It's not just every time I'm picking up a weight, the workout is wildly different. And then I'm 6 months down the road, I'm like, wow, like why haven't I actually really meaningfully improved my strength? And I kind of hear that's what you're saying. And I think for me, I'm trying to get people to always kind of like venture a little bit more toward the middle, right? Where the extremes are like the maximalist workouts. Or, I guess there's something to be said for some more minimal styles depending on the person and their training age, for example. But for most people, it's kind of like a meet in the middle, like you know, do we need to do 6 times a week of these more circuit styles where we're just constantly exhausted, like you said, overtrained, but not really getting adaptations? Or, we're so sporadic because we think it has to be perfect. Like neither of those is really helpful. Can we kind of, again, for midlife people or the folks that you're working with, can we kind of like meet in the middle a little bit and find a better way?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of what I heard you saying there that very much aligns up, unsurprisingly, with my philosophy is that we need structure and we need autonomy and choice. And I know that's something that we both do in our programs, which is we're like, here's a basic structure and here's some flexibility and autonomy. Do 2 to 3 sets, do 8 to 10 reps. I'm just pulling out numbers here, but people hopefully follow what I'm saying, right?
Yep.
Here are 4 different squatting options or 3 different squatting options. So you can choose the one that makes sense for you in that moment or for your body, and you can play around. And if you really like hate a hip thrust, we know I'm not a huge fan of those. Right?
Neither am I.
Right. You can do some backstepping lunges, but also if you love a hip thrust, okay, it's there too. So there's a lot of ways to sort of achieve a benefit of something, but we do need to be able to track some level and control some level of the variables. Or else it's just, if it works out, you kind of got lucky, which is not a bad thing. Again, I think this all just comes back to, what is your goal? Where are you at right now? Like, are you in a process right now where you're like, I'm just going to try to do something every day? That conversation is going to be so, so, so different than someone who is trying to specifically say increase their bone density or their muscle mass or whatever. So it just depends on where you are in terms of just what your goal is and how much time you have. But even on the note of time, I just want to make sure we touch on this.
Mhm.
If you have incredibly limited time, you are way better off doing one strength workout a week or two 30-minute ones a week that are well structured with appropriately challenging weight and some sense of tracking and progression. That is typically going to go so much better in terms of results, even if every day, even if it's random days of the week and they're right next to each other, they're super far apart, it will still go so much better than just randomly picking workouts that are designed to make you tired. And I think that's something that also gets missed, is that you can actually get a lot done in a very small amount of time if you are specific and clear on what you're trying to do.
Absolutely. I was just like cosign, cosign. No, I think that that's true. And, um, I do have people who do strong with stuff and they're like, hey, is it okay if I split, this day? Like I just ran out of time. Can I do my, I don't know, balance and plyo work and some of my accessories like the next day? And I'm like, yeah, they're like, that's fine. Just do what you need to do. But to your point, there is still a reason for the way that those things were structured and sequenced out. And I think the other thing that we didn't necessarily touch on yet is that, for a lot of people, especially people in our age bracket, if I can call us that, like our 40s and beyond, is, you know, a lot of people who listen to this podcast or who listen to your podcast or who are out there reading the information and they're trying to educate themselves and be like, okay, I get it. Like heavy lifting is important. I don't know how I'm gonna get there, but like I'm accepting of that fact, and that's not necessarily true of the wider world or people who are like our listeners, our community. They're like, fuck yeah, build muscle. Like let's like build some hamstring meat. I want to do this. And not like, oh, like lifting will make you bulky and that's the most horrible thing in the world. So we have a lot of people who are very much on board with this stuff. They're like, yes, I need to do this. I need to do this. However, depending on, like we've talked about, your experience level, how much past prior lifting you've had, what you've been doing to lead up to this. I know sometimes it's common to want to jump right into a program with everything being really, really, really heavy, really, really, um, few repetitions and things like that. And so this is just kind of a side tangent, maybe not necessarily related exactly to what we're talking about here, because side note, I did film an entire workout because I was like, I'm going to film all this whole workout with rest periods and I'm going to put it on YouTube. I still haven't done it because I wanted to do a voiceover. But y'all, like, it's not riveting watching. You know what I'm saying? But at the same time, we have to get prepared to be able to do these things. And the reason I kind of bring it up too is because we're always hearing plyometrics, 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 like good for our bones, like great for building power, like we need to be able to react quickly. If you cannot land well, absorb that force and then transfer it back up and out of the system because your tissues do not have the right amount of stiffness, which is actually a good thing in this case. If you can't land well, you don't have great body awareness. We are not going to have you jump on a 30-inch box right out the gate. So sometimes you'll see programs where they're like, yeah, like we're going to get you right into jumping and jumping and jumping. We love a jumping moment. We also know, you and I, like there are ways to scale this down, but we cannot put the cart before the horse. And when you're randomly jumping into a program, you don't know that it's going to be sequenced out in a way that's like, hey, okay, we're not gonna, no one's shaming anybody here. Like, it's been a while since you've worked out. No problem. We're gonna give your tissues the best possible runway to long-term, being healthy and strong. We can't prevent every single injury. We know that. But if you haven't done any jumping, are we going to make you do rapid response box jumps on day one? That seems like a really bad idea because our tissues are just not ready for that. So I think the point of this little side tangent is just, sometimes we get so focused on plyometrics, like I'm going to get this program that has plyometrics, but we haven't been doing any jumping, we haven't been doing any landing, controlling for that. It's probably not the best fit. Subsequently, if we haven't been lifting in, say, heavy sets of 5, we need to build up to that. Or maybe I should say we need to build down to that. We need to build the runway that gives us the best possible entry point. So a lot of times when you're doing more random things, you don't necessarily know that you're getting the proper preparation for what you're asking your body to do, or what that program is for. And a lot of times, again, how it's communicated to the wider consumer in a lot of these programs is not accurate. And so what people are getting themselves into sometimes, I mean, hopefully nothing bad happens, no injuries or things like that, but you just kind of don't know what you're getting yourself into when it's not properly labeled, discussed, there's no nuance to it.
Yes, and I'm going to do my best not to get us on a totally different tangent because I know we're wrap up time. But I
Yeah.
think you've brought up a really important point here, which is like it's really arbitrary what is labeled beginner, intermediate, advanced, all levels. And in
Mhm.
looking at and evaluating these programs inside this app, a lot of the beginner air quote programs were actually more challenging and complex and demanding than the intermediate ones because of how the workouts were sequenced together with reduced rest periods across several days and weeks. So if you don't live inside this world and you don't have a lot of nuanced education and conversation, it can be really hard to discern those things. But also, if you try something that's quote unquote beginner and this didn't work for you, you're not broken. You didn't do it wrong. Sometimes the programming really is a mismatch. Even if it's a quote unquote good program, just because of who you are and your unique history. I know I started a running program and I thought I was like, oh, I'm undershooting. It'll be just fine. And I made it 2 weeks in before I realized that, like, yeah, I'm hypermobile. I cannot progress in running that quickly. My cardiac system could take it, but my lower legs were like, bitch, back it down, like immediately. And I had to like check my ego at the door and be like, is it more important for my ego to run for 7 straight minutes, or is it more important to me to start at a place where my lower legs will adapt so eventually I can both run because my cardiac system is ready and run pain-free because my lower legs aren't super pissed off at me because I didn't jump in too hard, too fast, too soon. And so yeah, it's an ego check. It's annoying. Sometimes you do really you have to meet that limiting factor in some way, or at least acknowledge for it. And this doesn't exist in Gen Pop, average fitness, traditional fitness land. A lot of the time we are just thrown into this world where suddenly we're doing box jumps and backstepping lunges, and it's just not the right set of exercises in the right order with the right progressions. And it's why things go sideways. It's not that people are stupid and broken and everything is terrible. It's just that the progressions don't make sense a lot of the time. And so give yourself the tools to be successful. I guess that's what I'm going to say. If something's not working for you, you're not a terrible person. You probably just need a different approach or a scaled down approach, or something needs to be adjusted.
Yeah, for sure. I have taken lately to, when people send messages and they're like, "Hey, like can I learn more about your program?" One of the first things I ask now is, "Have you been strength training?" And then if they're like, "Yes," I'm like, "Well, can you kind of describe what that's like?" Because if someone hasn't been consistently lifting, I'm probably not going to say, "Go join Strong with Steph," because these workouts are on average about an hour. If somebody hasn't been lifting, I would rather start them off with something like dynamic dumbbells, which is, and I'm sure you've got like beginner and like slightly, you've got your other programs that are a little bit longer. I'm generally going to say, hey, take 3 months, be successful with like 30-minute workouts that are pretty pared down, but they're still going to hit on what you need. And then when you're good at that, go on to the next step. Or if you've never touched a weight, you've never done any strength training before, my best recommendation for most people is work with somebody in person, or if you have to like virtually across Zoom, it's not the same, but there are people out there that do it pretty well. Get some instruction to give yourself the best possible start. I know it's not possible in 100% of cases, but even if you can do a few sessions, you're still going to start yourself off with a much better starting point. So we know that a lot of people are like, yes, okay, I get it. I want to strength train. I need to strength train. I know this is important. It's important for my longevity. It's important for avoiding sarcopenia, for strengthening my bones, all this stuff that we know. But just because that's the case doesn't mean that every program that you see is going to be a good match for where you're at. And I think that's kind of what I hear us even saying throughout this episode is like, sometimes even though you and I have gone through the trenches, we have the background in education and even in long-term programming, it doesn't necessarily mean that our programs are going to be the best match for somebody that comes along and wants to lift weights.
Absolutely. And again, we've talked about this. It's not just how old you are. There's so many factors that are going to go into if something is a good fit for someone. And it's right. Do you have health conditions going on? What is your fitness background? Yeah, age is part of it, but age to me is like actually one of the lesser factors in a way. It'll account for some things that you may need to be aware of, but humans are complex. Programming is complex. And I'm not saying this stuff always needs to be super complicated. A lot of the time, the solutions are actually like you look at and you're like, that's all you want me to do, really? And you're like, yeah, that's actually a good starting point for you, right? It doesn't look exciting on paper at all. But again, I think that, right, we're not cookie cutters. We don't have cookie cutter bodies. And so like we can make these grand statements on social media, like lift heavy, but like some people aren't ready to lift heavy. I have some people who start with, and it's funny, we have a whole podcast about the problem with 2-pound dumbbells. And I have some people who start with 2-pound dumbbells, and for them, that is a massive success because of their history and where they are. And so everything that anyone does, anything that you or I or anyone says needs to be filtered through the context of lived experience and where someone is at. And I think that that can be tricky to do with group programming or templated programming or an internet conversation in general. But I think that's especially tricky to do when you're opening up an app and a follow along class. I think that's where I'm ending.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's, I mean, every once in a while you might see something like, hey, this program may not be for you if XYZ. When you are looking on, I'm thinking like, and again, there's plenty of popular ones, but these are apps that have like multiple different instructors, like different, they say intermediate or advanced, or this is strength training, or this is upper, lower, leg burn, booty buster, blaster, like all of these things. Very infrequently does the person, this is because a lot of these things are available either free on YouTube. I keep bringing up YouTube because these are very popular, like free on YouTube, or, you're going to opt in for like a low cost subscription monthly. And they're like, wow, look at all this variety and choice. But in a way, just because there's more choice doesn't necessarily make it better. And sometimes it's even harder to discern what is the right thing for you. So again, I hope people walk away from this episode just with the sense that, you know what, if I need to go read a sales page or go ask questions for the person that has this program, I'm like, send me your questions, send me your questions, because I want to help you make the best choice for you. And fairly frequently I turn people away because I'm not the best fit for them. I'm either going to send them to you, I'm going to send them to Brianna if they're like, you know, postpartum. I'm going to send them over here if they've got pelvic floor stuff. Like sometimes I am like, yeah, this person is actually way better matched for what you need. It's not me. Like I'm flattered. Thank you for thinking of this program, but I don't think it's the best fit for you at this time. And sometimes it is, hey, go ask around. Who do you know in your general vicinity? that can take you through some in-person stuff as well, because I think there's a lot of value to that. So that just becomes increasingly harder. The more choices you have, the, like, oh, I'll just jump into this class, this sort of thing. Getting moving for the sake of moving is totally fine. We're huge fans of that, but we know that a lot of people out there really want to get serious. I know probably for your community, it's finally getting through some of the noise of, hey, like strength training is going to hurt me. And you're like, okay, now I'm finally going to get out there and get a program that's probably actually better designed for somebody that has needs like mine. For my community, it's doing the things with, the considerations that we need to kind of take into account now that we're over 40 and things are changing a little bit. Like, what can we not skip over anymore as part of the program? And how do we do that in a way that's intelligently done? And like you said, clear. And I think that that's a lot of times the piece that's missing.
Yes.
Anything else you want to tell the good listeners? What are your programs and how can they find out more about that?
So thank you. So probably the easiest way to find out about my stuff is either to go to my website or find me on Instagram, which is the platform I'm most likely to actually look at or use. I'll just be honest. You can message me on the others. The odds that I'll see it and respond, it'll take a while. But I have an app-based program called Total Package Strength, and that is, funny enough, actually, if someone has a movement background, they feel comfortable enough to hold a dumbbell or a band, I have scaled that one down enough that if you're kind of like a beginner plus, you can probably do it, because I have sort of, you can do 2 or 3 days. I also have a lower volume version and a higher volume version, because I had what I thought was pretty moderate volume, and I got really appropriate feedback from people that was like, I really like this and my body needs less. And I was like, cool, we can do that. And I have some other beginner programs, but kind of like to your point, Steph, if you're interested in something and you're like, oh, I'm not sure if it's the right fit for me, like just send me a DM. If we can't discern through DMs what's right, I often hop on free intro calls with people if I'm just not sure if I'm the right person or where to send them, because sometimes I'm not. Sometimes I need to go to a physical therapist. Sometimes they're actually better suited for someone like you, Steph, where like their background is in more of some of that more intense lifting, and I'm like, you're gonna be real bored with me, I'm sorry. So that's what I would say is, like, if anything I said resonated, like, feel free to like come find me on Instagram or visit my website and say hello. I've got a podcast that I sometimes update, at least at this date. I'm sure we'll put those links in the show notes, but yeah, that's kind of it.
Cool. Well, I appreciate, as always, you coming on the podcast to unpack these topics. And, in the day and age where there are so many just hot takes, and I know you and I love a good hot take from time to time, I think it's also really important to discuss the nuance and the context. And that's why things like a podcast can really do that well, because we're able to kind of dig into some of this stuff. And it's like, yeah, if you're really focused on these goals, Peloton strength, or these other types of programs that build themselves as strength training may not be your best long-term solution. They may be something that gets you started. We like that. That you got started in the first place. And if you're like, this stuff isn't really working for me anymore, and you're feeling that pull, like it might be a time to do something new, to do something different, to find something that's more aligned to your goals. And I hope that's what people take away from this podcast. You and I are very much about like what suits that person. And hopefully that's what people have heard from this episode. So yeah, thanks for being on the show again. I think this is the third time. You're getting into a very elite group of people. I think we've only had a few people that have been on 3 or more times. So
I'm honored.
Happy to have you back, but thanks again. And I'm sure I will talk to you very soon.
Yes. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.